When the Taliban took control of Afghanistan's government in August 2021, women there and all over the world feared the worst. That has not stopped those women from speaking up. A new collection of essays amplifies some of their voices. It's called "We Are Still Here: Afghan Women on Courage, Freedom, and the Fight to Be Heard." And we're pleased to welcome two of the contributors to our studio. Maryam Safi, founding executive director of the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies, a think tank based in Kabul, Afghanistan, and Toronto. Amina Sharif, a producer, activist, and founder of Sisters for Sisters, a mentorship program for socially marginalized children in Afghanistan. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
The Taliban has been running the country for a year now. How would you describe life for Afghans today? Maryam, I'll start with you.
Since the fall of the Islamic Republic last year, life has been incredibly difficult and treacherous, not only for Afghan citizens, particularly for Afghan women. And that is because politically there's been no clarity on the political path forward. There is no constitution in the country. Economically, the country is facing a dire humanitarian crisis. About 97% of the country is currently in need of humanitarian aid, and 100% of all female-headed households. And so at the present moment, especially in the last few months, we've also seen socially various decrees and edicts issued by the Taliban that have curbed and restrained women, practically bringing them back into the home and confining them in that home. So women are not permitted to leave their homes unless absolutely necessary. They're not allowed to work unless in the health or education sector, perhaps, and they're not allowed to travel, and if they do, it has to be with a male relative. So the situation overall is very dark. It's very grim. For women in particular, the country, their homes have become a prison.
You're on this side of the world, and you're looking at the headlines, and for some of us, we might have that detachment of the headlines because we're not from there. But for you both to watch this unfolding over the past year, what does that feel like for you? Mina, I'll start with you.
I'll say I share the sentiment of my friends and loved ones in Afghanistan, where I'm essentially still in a state of shock. And I will add that, like you mentioned, Taliban are in their second role of taking over the role of leadership in Afghanistan. This is the second round. So the shock is not so much what Taliban are doing, but that they've been left to deal with that after being promised otherwise. So that state of shock has been just consistent. And I kept thinking that we would kind of learn to adjust around it, and we haven't gotten there yet. A lot of people are still looking for what they missed. Mm-hmm. How is this happening? And I think I'm still there
in
as
shock.
well.
Maryam, Mina mentioned being in shock. Is there also a sense of maybe betrayal?
There is a very deep sense of betrayal. The Afghan people had partners in the international community. International actors had worked alongside the Afghan government, alongside Afghan civil society organizations and people for 2 decades, post-2001, when the Taliban was toppled by the US. So working together for 2 decades, trying to build a young democracy, institutions, civil society community, programs and trainings and all the advancements that we had seen in Afghanistan. Basically, the state building or peace building process was done together throughout these 2 decades. And the commitment and the promise of partnership was something that Afghans felt was not going to leave their side so fast and so abruptly. Mm-hmm. The withdrawal of US and NATO forces in Afghanistan was anything but responsible. Mm-hmm. And we were advocating for a responsible withdrawal, which would have meant that the international community, with a lesser presence, but would stay for a bit longer until we were able to stand on our own 2 feet. We were not able to do that last year, and women advocates and the women's movement for peace, especially in the last few years, had been advocating for that, and going on several platforms and initiating that we must build more sustainable conditions for the withdrawal, and that did not seem to have come at the right time.
I'm going to come back to, you brought up a lot of great points. I want to come back to those. But we've been talking about the different emotions that have been experienced, the shock, the betrayal. But have Afghans been given the chance to mourn the 40 years of constant war that they've experienced? Mina?
I think that's quite a good point, because it's an oversight when we look at how Afghans react to anything. It helps us understand why they were so quick to take on a trusting relationship with the international presence. They had seen so much conflict that it was the only choice to get on board and to trust that there was a secure environment to partner up and to believe in a long-term commitment to freedoms, especially for Afghan women. It helps us understand why that happened so quickly. And no pause has happened from one generation to the next where a parent or a grandparent hasn't seen a different war.
What have Afghan women lost in the last 12 months, Mina?
Well, I think from a distance, we need things that are very visual and easy to conceptualize based on our lives in a completely different world. So when the Taliban issued clothing restrictions and said that women needed to dress like this, it was easy for us in the West to understand that. It was something visual. This is what Taliban are saying they wear, and it appears that that's not Afghan clothing. But that's such a surface level problem that Afghan women are dealing with right now. They want basic human rights, and I think that message isn't getting across because we're unable to see just how bad it is. When they say that women need a mahram, so an escort to leave, a male escort to leave their home.
A family member, or yeah.
Correct. Some of them just don't have that option. It's not so much that they want the liberty to walk the streets freely. Sure, they do, but a lot of women are at that point that they can't do that. They don't have the option to go buy food for their children because they can't comply with those new rules.
So what happens to them if they can't go out to do all this?
Well, based only, I can say, on the first round of the Taliban leadership, people had to find solutions like dressing as men to escort family members. Sometimes your family member escort is a 2-year-old child. It's a matter of sensibility and just being able to accommodate that for your survival. We're not at liberation of rights yet, and I think because that's where we are in the West, we tend to want to see it through that lens in Afghanistan. These women are asking for the right to work, the right to access food, and the right to very basic freedoms.
I want to read an excerpt from the book, and this is from the editor, Nahid Shalahimi, and what she wrote in the book. Women's voices are banned from the radio. Women can no longer appear on TV. Mirrors in offices and other buildings have disappeared. Beauty salons have been closed. Women can no longer travel long distances without a male family member accompanying them. The colors, the beauty, and the diversity are supposed to disappear. Even our flag has disappeared. Instead, the colorless black and white flag of the Taliban flies. The Ministry of Women's Affairs was closed in September 2021 and replaced by the Ministries of Prayer and Guidance and the Promotion of Virtues and Prevention of Vice. One of the ministers even went so far as to say the only 2 acceptable places for a woman are at home or in a graveyard. Miriam, you hear that, you think what?
To be very frank, I can't believe we have come back to this point. To see the rollback of women's rights in Afghanistan so rapidly within a year's time is absolutely devastating. The gains of the last 20 years for which women in Afghanistan fought so hard for, their equality, their rights, their access, this did not come easy to Afghan women. Of course, with the support of the international community, they fought for them and they took those rights. So when I hear that the Taliban, several statements they've made where they basically pronounce the role of women to be only within the household, it's very, very tragic. But interestingly, it's not only tragic for Afghan women, it's actually also very tragic for the Taliban and their future. And the reason for that is by confining women within the household, it has cost the Afghan GDP about $1 billion a year. Afghan women made 20% of the workforce. Now that's 5% of the Afghanistan GDP, and at a time when international economic development aid has not come back into the country because the Taliban have not met their commitments to respecting women's rights and inclusivity and human rights, etc. For those particular reasons, the international community hasn't given their aid, and so they really require this. So when you confine half of the population, there are consequences to that, and these are those consequences. And to be very honest with you, I don't know how long the Taliban would be able to continue attempting to run a state under these circumstances.
You mentioned the GDP, $1 billion is a lot of money. So if they stand to lose, what would you say this modern day Taliban is afraid of when it comes to women?
See, the Taliban are not one homogenous group. They're quite fragmented. And so one of the things that are quite important for the Taliban is to keep the cohesiveness of this group. To do that, one of the main pillars of their fight or their jihad in Afghanistan was to free Afghan women from the domination of Western countries and Western values that are not aligned with our cultural values or our religious values. Now, that's been the ideology that they've been fed. Now, for the leadership of the Taliban to now start allowing women to work or to go to school, it would signal to the foot soldiers, upon whom the Taliban leadership rely on immensely, it would signal that, well, the last 20 years, this ideology was wrong, this narrative was wrong. Therefore, in order to keep this cohesiveness, the Taliban are stuck, the leadership is stuck in a very difficult position, where on the one hand, they do realize that they need to be flexible, they need to move forward and be a bit more progressive. But on the other hand, they can't lose their foot soldiers, upon whose backs they were able to take over Afghanistan. And so it's going to be a balancing act for them. So far, they've really failed at it miserably. I don't know how long they'll be able to continue to keep that, because there's pressure from the international community on the one hand, and there's pressure from their foot soldiers on the other.
You know, we're talking about women and the challenges that they're experiencing, and I can only imagine what it's like for young girls who are watching this and learning. Mina, a whopping 42% of Afghans are under the age of 15. Unlike their elders, many Afghan girls up until last year would have never known an Afghanistan where their freedoms were so restricted. You are in regular contact with young girls. How are they processing everything that's happened in the last year?
Well, yeah, that's the thing with women, just age-wise, obviously it varies, but even from that age group, it's not a monolith. I'm obviously speaking to the most advantaged of the young women, because they are still able to collect together, gather together, and have these conversations with me. And I said earlier that everyone's in shock, and I think that includes them. They're stunned and really trying to grasp how big the loss is. And I think you can see that it's not quite sinking in when they ask me for sporting materials and water bottles to do their exercise, and they are just looking forward to when they can go back outside on their bikes. And it's hard to imagine how difficult it's going to be for them to understand that that's so far down the line in comparison to what has actually been cut out of their rights. There are young girls, in fact, that are planning to intentionally flunk out of the 6th grade.
Why?
Just to ensure that they can stay in school, because they'll be cut off otherwise from going on furthering education.
Recently, in a rare show of public defiance, women in Kabul protested their treatment, chanting, "We want work, bread, and freedom." They were met by Taliban with AK-47s, dispersing their crowds with gunfire. Let's take a look. Watching that is very hard. just hearing the cocking of the guns, what sort of risks do women run by defying these rules against them, working, seeking education, wearing the full veil? Miriam?
Death. That's the risk that they're taking when they're going onto the streets and protesting in front of a group that was and continues to be a terrorist organization. Death is the risk for them. And we've seen on multiple occasions women going onto the streets and chanting. And this chant in particular is quite unique and important. They're chanting for bread, work, freedom. And the reason why they've put it in that order, I believe, is bread signifying, of course, food, nourishment to live. Work meaning after bread, that's not where it ends for us. That's not where our demands end. Because the Taliban continue to espouse a narrative that if we fill hungry stomachs, then our society will be absolutely fine. But the women are saying no. Bread, then work. Independence. Because in Afghanistan, when women bring home an income, that ensures that they have a voice. And then after that, freedom. Now, all three are women's demands in Afghanistan, not just bread, meaning not just humanitarian aid. And that's something that Afghan women, especially those who have been evacuated and who have left, have been advocating to international donors and actors for the past year, saying that humanitarian alone is not the only demand of Afghan women. And that we need continued international support to be able to bring development in the country and capacity building and empowerment. And we have to have the Taliban to show those flexibilities and to relax on their restraints so we could do that.
You mentioned aid. We're going to come back in just a moment. But Tamina, in your chapter in the book, you describe the West's eras when it came into our involvement in Afghanistan, that Afghans did not need to be, quote, told how to live, end quote, that we didn't need to, quote, recreate what life is like in the West, end quote. Did the West too often impose its way of life on Afghans?
I think the West entered Afghanistan with the pretext that we were there to show them democracy, to show them how to take part in society, to take positions of leadership, and to play a role in Afghanistan. And it was very soon after landing that I personally realized that that was the incorrect narrative to enter Afghanistan with, and that had been a part of Afghanistan's history for thousands of years. And so, being that we weren't listening before we went in, it was even more so damaging not to listen throughout the entire period of those 20 years. Programs were created without the functionality that Afghan women needed and without the sustainability that they needed. And this is why a big part of why it's crashed the way it has. So the lack of listening has led to so many inconsistencies in narrative as well, and that's why women have to tell you how basic their needs are. They have to chant it, and yet we have Taliban on television and on platforms saying that these women just want something Western.
Well, you said the lack of listening. What do you mean? Is it like the lack of listening from the international community? We're not listening to women?
I don't think there is a single entity that listens to Afghan women directly, unfortunately. From the Afghan leadership themselves and onwards to the programs that were designed specifically for Afghan women, very rarely were they asked what could work based not only on their culture, and again, I think we go very visual in that sense of were we being culturally appropriate? Well, were we being functional in their lives is a better question. A lot of times I saw women being offered computer courses, and then that was the end of it. No computer, no job, just a computer course. So these are examples of the not listening throughout the 20 years. But and now we're failing to hear how basic those needs are, and so it's difficult to see it as dire as it is. And unfortunately, parallel to that, we have Taliban claiming that it's Western demands they're making.
Since 2014, Canada has spent something like $966 million on what it says to help empower and support Afghan women and girls. Is this money well spent, or is this money, or are we kind of patting ourselves on the back for something that hasn't really helped? Miriam?
I think that the the money that came into Afghanistan, and Canada was quite a significant donor, particularly when it came to women, peace, and security. Canada was one of the largest investors in ensuring that women had access and had a voice in all issues and all policy-making decisions within the country. But the problem is, as Mina described earlier, the problem is that the state-building agenda or the peace-building agenda in Afghanistan is not an only example. We've seen this happen in several countries before that. We saw this similar scenario in Rwanda, for example, and other countries. And what we see is that there is always a blueprint for state building and peace building that always comes with international actors. And that blueprint is designed outside and then imposed locally upon the host society. And that's exactly what happened in Afghanistan. But to also add to what Mina stated, I would say that the failures of the international agenda in Afghanistan is there was no component of local ownership. Afghans were not given ownership of the process from the very, very beginning. And if anyone argues otherwise, what they're pointing to is that very small group of elite, perhaps politicians, certain actors within the Afghan government that they partner up with. Just partnering up with them, with elites alone, does not signify promoting ownership in the country. So there was no local ownership, and you would be so surprised at how reluctantly the international community takes lessons learned. I'm quite surprised. I would not be surprised that now that the international community has left Afghanistan and they'll move on to another country where they'll do the same state building, the same peace building programs, that you don't see a repeat of what happened in Afghanistan. They simply do not learn these lessons. Mm-hmm. And another huge problem that we faced in Afghanistan was that in Afghanistan, the international community, along with the Afghan government, were trying to build a state while also doing counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. You cannot fight and build at the same time. That's a conclusion that I think many of us have come to as we've reflected this past year. And that's what we were doing in Afghanistan. We were building and fighting at the same time.
Do you think that Western countries should recognize the Taliban as the government? Mina?
No, just because if we are going to recognize them as a democratically elected government, they are not that. And as far as aid reaching people directly, there are ways to do that, and there are ways to do that that have been shown through, for example, Afghan examples of direct access to local communities most in need. I think that it's also a great example of how the system was always designed from the outside rather from the inside out. And there is ample opportunity to work with the Taliban if needed, but with follow-up and measure control of where that aid is distributed. I think it's not a matter of working with the Taliban. It's about placing conditions on how the aid is distributed and monitoring it closely, which didn't happen in the last 20 years. So we're quite concerned about that happening to good measure with the Taliban now.
You were both born in Afghanistan and left for Canada when you were young. Then you came back home to do what you thought you could do to help the country. But do you see Afghan women who recently fled being able to even do that today?
I think that once, at the present moment, it's difficult for those who have left Afghanistan right now. But with those whom I am in contact with, and a lot of the women who left Afghanistan, whether they were civil society actors, parliamentarians, judges, politicians, journalists, they're all hoping for the day they can return.
Do you feel not a betrayal, but do you feel, we talk about the survivor's guilt, and being on the other side of it and not being able to help, and then seeing what's happening and then trying to shout to the policymakers, this is what and nothing being done. What is that feeling like?
Well, I feel that being out is not, the fact that I'm not in Afghanistan is not on me. And so I don't allow myself to feel guilty about not being able to be there right now. Women who have spoken out within Afghanistan, there was a woman named Tamana who was recently interviewed, and she had filmed her arrest. And had she not filmed her arrest, they would have continued to deny that she was ever arrested at all, which they do. But she has videoed that and believes that that's why she survived her arrest and the torture that ensued afterwards. So we know for a fact that it's not safe for women to speak up. And so we have to be the extension of their voice outside of Afghanistan and speak up for them. And to feel that as a duty makes me feel responsible and still a part of my Afghan community in that sense.
Miriam, we have about 30 seconds left. For policymakers who are watching this show, what do you want them to know?
For policymakers, a key message would be any engagement, any dialogue with the Taliban should be complemented with conditions, tough conditions. And these conditions can be on relaxation of restrictions on women's mobility, respect for women's rights, respect for the Constitution, and respect for citizens' rights to bring about an inclusive government in their country. Without these conditions in place, we will not see a change in the Taliban, and the Taliban will continue to progress this way. There can be absolutely no recognition of the Taliban unless they start meeting some of the promises and commitments they themselves made when they took over Kabul. And that was an inclusive government, respect for women's rights, and a constitution that would espouse equality. And we haven't seen any of that come about so far. So unless that's met, recognitions should be absolutely off the table. But in addition to that, they have to place pressure. They have to use their leverage, which is the humanitarian aid that is going into Afghanistan, to be able to make headways with the organization.
Miriam, Amina, thank you so much for being on the show. We appreciate your insights and your voices. The book is called We Are Still Here, Afghan Women on Courage, Freedom, and the Fight to be Heard. And it's kind of cool that Margaret Atwood wrote the foreword.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, great.
That's quite wonderful.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.